We went back to Lester's room at the motel. He had paid at the beginning of the month, as he always did, as a part of his shady rental agreement with the owner. I didn't ask any questions, happy we had somewhere to go. He hadn't told me yet that the room was now essential to our mission. That's where the portal was. When we arrived, he shut the door behind us, and I had déjà vu as he began taking bottles of cough syrup out of plastic shopping bags. He pulled off the childproof caps, wasting no time. He handed 2 of the bottles to me and kept 4 to himself. We had talked about this earlier. He had told me 2 bottles would be a lot for a beginner. He said that he would take what's left of the second bottle after I had as much as I could tolerate. We had bought saltine crackers to chew up to try to cover the taste of the terrible medicinal-tasting cough syrup, and I employed them readily. I managed to drink the first bottle and looked over to see Lester had already consumed 2 of his and was starting on the third. He chugged it while I watched, revolted but impressed. I managed to finish half the second bottle before being overcome by nausea. Lester told me it would be best if I stopped as he smacked his syrupy lips. He took the bottle out of my hand and drank it quickly, since he had already consumed the 4 he had allotted himself. I sat down on the bed and tried not to throw up. I focused my attention on a dead bug on the wall until that grossed me out. Then I tried to count the dots on the ceiling. That made me nauseated as well. I went back to staring at the bug on the wall and was relieved when the nausea began to pass after several long minutes. After a while, we were both quite high. Lester told me to watch closely as he walked with wobbly steps over to the corner of the room where a strange white glow had begun to spread. The room had felt different when we walked in, but it was more noticeable now. The white glow had a warmth to it that was spreading like a fire, burning hotter and hotter in the corner of the room. I think it's this room. You know how that old-ass furnace beneath us is always vibrating like crazy? Doesn't that feel weird to you? He looked at me, and I told him I had always noticed the vibration. It reminded me of a documentary I had seen where the resonant frequency of a bridge had been met by some natural forces, and the suspension bridge had begun to sway and wobble, and waves began to flow through it like a wave pool at a water park. The surreal-looking waves had collapsed the bridge, destroying it. It was one of those reality is stranger than fiction moments for me, watching the old black and white videos as cars and people bounced and flew through the air on the huge suspension bridge, which had been turned into a giant catastrophic waveform. I felt the vibration of the furnace was matching a resonant frequency with my body, or the universe, somehow. The glow I was experiencing from the cough syrup was making it more apparent, and I felt it flowing through me like waves through the ocean's surface. The waves were becoming noticeably stronger. So I think that's what lets me do this. He reached his hand toward the most concentrated part of the white light in the corner of the room. His finger bent reality as if it were a t-shirt hanging to dry. It stretched and pulled and gave way. He poked a hole right through, and then his hand went in as well. He looked at me triumphantly. Then, a moment later, his face turned to a horrified panic. He was suddenly yanked right through the hole and was gone in an instant. I walked towards the hole, horrified but also curious. My friend had suddenly vanished from the face of the earth. I stared at the portal in disbelief. I knew I had to close it. There was no sense in running away. Whatever was in there, we had to face it. I couldn't just leave him in there, and I had no idea how to close the damn thing myself. I approached the portal, now a doorway-sized hole of white light, and walked through on trembling legs. The room I entered on the other side was a grim courtroom. It was ancient and enormous. In front of me towered a giant dais, where hooded beings sat perched upon ornate thrones. Their robes were dark gray, and they stared at us without mercy. Lester sat in a chair ahead of me and to my right. I felt a bony hand grab my wrist and looked over to see the wizardly old man in white was leading me into... I felt a bony hand grab my wrist and looked over to see the old wizardly man in white was leading me towards an empty seat. He whispered in my ear, "The pain you will experience will be nothing compared to his. Do not fight them when they make their ruling. Be satisfied if they spare your life." With that, he left me. I sat down in the chair next to Lester and looked up at the overseers. My legs were watery and my stomach felt like a butterfly sanctuary. I tried not to shit my pants as I regarded the stern-looking faces above me.
You have been called before the Council of Oversight, charged with breaching the boundaries between worlds.
The one in the middle said piously. I looked over at Lester and saw that he was extremely high. He appeared to be on the verge of a panic attack. The creatures' faces probably weren't helping since they were constantly shifting and changing, which would be disconcerting even when completely sober. I tried not to panic as my grip on reality loosened one more notch.
How do you plead to these charges? You first, Lester of Earth. You are the most guilty in all of this. What say ye?
Lester looked very ill. I was worried that he would projectile vomit as he had been known to do, but he managed to gulp whatever was coming up on him back down in a loud swallow. I humbly apologize, revered overseers, Lester said, achieving roughly half of his intended words with their appropriate pronunciations. They looked at him with eyebrows arched. He didn't say anything else and sat down hard in his chair, nearly tipping it over. I looked at him horrified. I knew he was high, but didn't he realize his life was at stake? I selfishly hoped that his statement wouldn't affect their ruling when it came to my life. I cringed, realizing I was already resigning Lester to the death penalty. The overseers shook their head and looked frustrated. They conferred amongst themselves and then they addressed me.
And you, Jason of Earth, how do you plead?
I plead innocent, Your Honors. I did not open up the gateway between worlds. I am only here to help ensure that it is closed, I said with as much sincerity as I could muster. It was the truth after all.
Very well. Let us make our decision.
That was fast, I thought. We had been allowed to make our pleas of innocent or guilty, and then it went straight to judgment in this courtroom. But then, these were all-knowing interdimensional judges. They had access to all possible realities, so they knew the outcome of every decision we have ever made. At least this was my understanding of things. The possibility of this all being a hallucination has been suggested to me, at times somewhat forcefully, but I choose to reject that possibility. They went into a back room. I looked over my shoulder and saw the old man in white on one side of the portal with the man in black on the other. They were holding long halberds and looked like yin-yang guardians of the gateway. The white doorway shone between them, the glow waxing and waning. After what felt like an eternity, the overseers returned.
We have decided your fate.
The one in the middle boomed loudly.
You, Lester of Earth, have been found guilty of crimes against the Great Onion. You have been sentenced to die. Do you have any last words?
Lester looked to be almost in a stupor. He shook his head slightly, seeming not to comprehend. I couldn't believe my ears, but I was also waiting to hear my judgment. I was terrified, wondering if it would be the same.
The only way for the gateway to be closed is to be bound and stitched closed by the flesh of the ones who made it. Guards, make it so.
The ancient beings in their black and white robes pulled us effortlessly over to the gateway. I was sweating, trying to comprehend the verdict from the overseers. They had said the portal needs to be closed with the flesh of those who made it. I looked at Lester. He was swaying back and forth and his eyes were mostly closed. He appeared to be hallucinating vividly and was swatting at phantom flies and scratching invisible bugs on his skin. Hands suddenly forced me to the ground, and I saw the man dressed in black was standing over me, licking his lips. He held a sharp knife in his hand and leaned over me as I was forced down onto the stone floor. "Back again for more we are," said the man in black. "My blade was thirsty. It missed you, dearie," he whispered wetly into my ear as he began to slice into my shoulder. Starting with a long cut, he went down to my wrist. I screamed as blood poured out from the edges of the wound, drowning the lines of his cut. His hand stayed calm and smooth as he brought the knife back up in a parallel line. He pulled a long strip of flesh off in one piece, like an expert orange peeler. The man in white held me down with a blank stare on his face while the other sliced off strip after strip of bloody flesh from my body while I screamed. When they had hacked and sliced me up, leaving me as a writhing, shiny red thing on the floor, they turned their attention to Lester. I lay on the stones shivering as I listened to his howls of pain. I could no longer bear to watch. I covered my face with my hands and wept, just begging for it to be over. Finally, the screaming stopped, and I looked up. The man in white was standing in front of the portal. He poked 4 new holes in the fabric of the universe around the 4 corners of the doorway, and wove pieces of bloody flesh through them, tying them together. When he had the ribbons of flesh pulled through, he wove them closed at the center, and I watched as the fabric of reality stretched and pulled closed. I heard a loud snap, and just like that, the gateway was gone, along with the flesh which had tied it back together. Lester gurgled and made blood bubbles with his mouth. His eyes fluttered and closed. His head suddenly fell down, hitting the stone floor with a loud crack. I looked and saw he was no longer breathing. I cursed the beings silently, afraid of what they would do if I had said anything to their faces. I still hadn't received my own judgment, I realized, with fear blossoming in my belly once again.
The gateway is closed, Jason of Earth. You helped to bring it into existence, and for that you must be punished.
I was still curled up on the floor in the fetal position, hoping it was over. I realized that it wasn't. The man in white strode forward and stood before the dais. They conferred, and I got the impression that he was trying to argue for my life to be spared. I was too tired and exhausted to be grateful. The world was going black around the edges, and I was worried I would pass out. My hands trembled from fear and lack of oxygen. Finally, the man in white walked back to where I stood. The overseers were conferring amongst themselves and looked to be coming to a conclusion. I realized I was holding my breath and let it out.
We will spare your life,
the judge in the middle said loudly.
but these transgressions cannot be allowed to pass without punishment.
I thought, but I didn't say, that I believed being skinned alive was punishment enough. The man in white caught my eyes and gave me a subtle shake of the head. I stayed silent.
Your punishment shall be fitting to the crime.
The overseer on the left boomed.
You have entered the world of dreams by means of the portal you created. Thus, you will no longer be allowed to enter that world any longer. The sleep portal will now be closed to you. This is our judgment.
The man in white began to protest. He said the ruling wasn't fair, that it was too harsh. I didn't understand then, but I do now. They sent me back to Earth in a ball of white light, which disappeared as I walked back out into Lester's motel room. I looked in the mirror and screamed when I saw the creature which looked back at me. I thought it was something horrible from another dimension at first, but then I realized it was only my own ruined face staring back at me. I went to bed and laid down, grateful to finally be able to sleep again. My eyes closed and I passed out instantly. The overseers had said they would make it so I could never enter the sleep portal to the world of dreams ever again. And that's exactly what happened. I woke up hours later feeling no more refreshed than when I had fallen asleep. I still felt exhausted, only more so. I slept for longer and longer, but it made no difference. I've done research in the days since, and it turns out that we need REM sleep to function properly. Without it, our bodies won't feel rested. What the overseers did, I can no longer dream. My mind is a blank slate each night for 8 hours, and when I wake up, I feel worse than when I went to bed. I'm starting to lose my grip on reality now after weeks and months of this. I've gone to doctors, sleep experts, and hypnotists, but they all say the same thing. I can't enter REM sleep. It's like there's something blocking it. I've been told the longer this goes on, the more issues I will have. Hallucinations, tremors, autonomic dysfunction, and many more symptoms are listed when you search WebMD and look up sleep disorders. I'm beginning to see things in my waking life. Things that aren't there. I see a man in black coming at me with a knife when I lie trying to sleep in darkened rooms. When I watch daytime TV, I see every judge as a shifting-faced overseer. When I go with my parents to church, the man in white at the podium looks down at me and winks and tells me to just go along with it. Don't fight them when they make their ruling. My pain would be nothing compared to his. I am starting to think that might not be right.